Our topic today is how Justinian destroyed Rome to save it. How he destroyed maybe the Roman Empire, or actually the Roman part of the Roman Empire, Italy, Rome itself, in order to revive the dream of the Roman Empire. We have just spent the last month in Istanbul, in Constantinople, and many of you have sent me videos of the They Might Be Giants song, so yes, I'm aware of that song, and it goes through my head. And we started looking around at some of the longer form lectures we might do. So the last month we've been going around to different sites and doing shorts, and we'd hope to do more than we did, but actually they end up being a lot of work, and I have to talk really fast in order to get it all into a short. So somebody saw one of them and said, this is sort of like what happens if you take a 2-hour lecture and just distill it down to 2 minutes. And so we realized that we hadn't done any lectures on Justinian, and Justinian is such an important figure in Western history, the history of the Roman Empire, and also of Christianity. And so it's sort of surprising that we hadn't done that. And so we wanted to look at Justinian tonight. One of the incredible legacies of Justinian is the Hagia Sophia. This was constructed in his reign between the years 532 and 537. It was still, we were able to go and visit it and tour it. It's still one of the perhaps most impressive historic structures that survives from antiquity. And so when it was completed, Justinian's just amazing monumental church was not only the largest church in the world, it was actually the world's largest interior space. And the space still amazes 1,500 years later, the size of the dome. If you go by the nearby Ottoman mosque, like the Blue Mosque that stands opposite it, even though it's made 1,000 years later, and it's a huge, impressive building, nevertheless, the dome of the Blue Mosque is half the size of Hagia Sophia, which is so much older. As maybe I'm calling it here even the culmination of Roman architecture, if the Hagia Sophia was Justinian's only legacy, that might alone be impressive enough to really remember him. We remember structures like other great builder emperors like Hadrian, who built the Pantheon and one of the other really amazing artifacts of antiquity. And he's, of course, also famous for building Hadrian's Wall, and indeed for rebuilding the destroyed city of Jerusalem, which he named after himself, Aelia Capitolina. And so actually most of the oldest parts of the city that are there are actually Hadrian's city in Jerusalem today. So we remember Hadrian for that. I mean, you remember him for other things as well. He's also a great emperor. Like I say, Hagia Sophia is by itself such an important thing that might be enough to get, Justinian a call out in the history books. But he has a lot of other legacies. So for example, he codified a uniform rewriting of Roman law. He was the very first emperor to do this. The Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, where he took all of the law codes that had been issued by all of the emperors since Hadrian, and he compiled them all together. In addition, he had all the edicts of both the Eastern and the Western Roman emperors, and these were also obsolete laws were deleted, laws were clarified, and he created a unified code, the very first time that any Roman emperor had done that. And that document wasn't just then put in some library or monastery library or whatever, and come down to us as an important historical document. It rather it went straight into use, and it became the foundation for civil law throughout much of continental Europe. It's also the basis for canon law in the church. So a huge legacy from that standpoint as well. And for somebody like me, who from childhood spent his time looking in atlases, and especially historical atlases, and just poring over them, Justinian always stands out as one of these rare historical figures who gets his own map pretty much in every atlas of world history, because he did a lot to actually change the map in a very interesting way. And so that's one of his other major legacies. And for those of you who tune into this and like maps, this is going to be a very map-heavy lecture, so you can have that to look forward to. So let's start with the Justinian map. So this is a variation of the map that Justinian gets in every historical atlas. And so we'll look on this particular one where you see the dark orange. This is the empire that he inherited. So the East Roman Empire still, largely intact and centered on the capital, Constantinople, which is in eastern Thrace at the end of the Balkan Peninsula, with a strategic control over the straits there, that is controlling traffic between the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea, and also at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, so an amazingly strategic location that had also been defended by amazing walls that allowed the Eastern Empire to survive when the West fell. And in addition, maintaining control over all of Asia Minor, Anatolia, what we now mostly think of as Turkey, but in addition, the Roman provinces of Syria, and especially Syria and Palestine, and especially Egypt. So that was what he inherited. And then this kind of yellow part, North Africa, essentially Libya, Tunisia, and parts of Algeria and Morocco, Italy and the Dalmatian coast, and then little tip of Spain. And so areas that had been, the heartland of the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, but had fallen in the intervening time when the Western Roman Empire collapsed. So those were restored, Rome restored by Justinian's death. So we now take all of those bullet points. So Hagia Sophia, the Corpus Juris Civilis, restoring Rome on the map at least. If Justinian's legacy rested on those bullet points, he might not just be called Justinian the Great, but maybe even the greatest. He might be thought of as another refounder of Rome, like Romulus and Caesar Augustus, Octavian, who refounded Rome. Here, Justinian also is another refounder. Unfortunately, unlike Caesar Augustus, that had this amazing legacy in the sense of an empire that ends up having a lot of stability for centuries, that doesn't end up being the case for Justinian's revived empire. And so his actual legacy is therefore mixed, and indeed some scholars cite him as maybe the last Roman emperor, and that was certainly this biography by J.P. Baker is titled that. So we'll look at maybe that claim. And so, for example, we'll just as a bit of a preview, we'll say, we had Justinian's map where he revives and restores the empire, but then if we just look half a century after his death, the Roman Empire, the revived empire, is now the area in blue. And so you can see within half a century of Justinian's reign, the empire has lost, at least at this point, Syria and Egypt, and Palestine to the Persians. The Avars have put a lot of pressure on the Balkans, and Slavs have overrun much of the Balkans, including historic Greece. And the Lombards, another Germanic confederation, has come and reclaimed the majority of Italy. So the empire now sort of seems exhausted and on its last legs just half a century after Justinian, instead of having been revived and renewed and reinvigorated. So let's look at how we got there. So let's get a little context of Justinian. We do that by going back to 395 and the reign of Theodosius the Great. Theodosius is the last emperor to briefly rule both halves of the empire. So he was an East Roman emperor. He fought a bunch of civil wars. In the course of that, he was able to defeat any Western rivals and rule the entire thing. And when we look at sort of this map of the combined Eastern and Western Roman empires in the year 395 under Theodosius, you can squint and say this is almost what you think of as what the empire looked like under Augustus. So there again had been this kind of incredible 400 years of stability, even though it wasn't always fully stable that entire time, but it's an amazing staying power for a state, for an empire like this. Nevertheless, already in the reign of Theodosius, we can see precursors of what's going to happen. So let's look at how this empire is looking at the end of the 4th century. And so the empire and the emperors are especially concerned with defending the frontiers. Mostly in the interior of the empire is largely self-governing, and there's a lot of authority happening at the provincial and civic levels, city government, that the emperor isn't particularly immediately concerned with all the time. The emperors are especially concerned with, they're especially military leaders, and they're concerned with taxing enough in order to be able to support a military, in order to defend frontiers. And so, as of 395, the empire is under substantial pressure at its frontiers. In the west, we have a whole long frontier along the Rhine and the Danube, behind which are growing Germanic confederations, tribes like the Franks, the Burgundians, and the Vandals, who have had a lot of contact already with Roman stuff, and so they are very, at this point, they've largely become Christians, albeit a different kind of Christianity than is practiced within the empire. They're mostly the Burgundians, the Vandals, the Goths, and so on have become Arian Christians, which is part of these early Christological controversies we talk about. The shorthand of it is Arianism asserts that that Christ is, fully separate from God the Father, and is to a degree inferior to the Father. So Christ is the first of God's creations, as opposed to being a separate person of God. And so they've come, but they're Christian. They're involved in the imperial culture, and they've been living on the other side of the frontier for many centuries. Now they have grown very populous, while the population of the empire has been in decline. And they're under incredible pressure because a non-Germanic, a confederacy coming from Central Asia off the steppes, the Huns, have come in and are causing a new threat. They're causing anybody who is conquered by them to join their horde and be part of their federates, and in a lot of cases the Germanic configurations would prefer to be allies and federates of Rome and fight on the other side, but they need support for that. And so anyway, we can see here then the frontiers and how important they are. The Eastern Empire has also a lot of pressure, but somewhat smaller frontiers. So the northern frontier, again along the Danube, is the border with the Huns and the other Germanic confederations, the Goths. And then there's the eastern frontier, where Rome is confronting its main state rival. So the Persian Empire, which is a settled empire like Rome, and has been kind of the long-standing rival throughout Roman history. But the difference is that the Persian Empire has now become stronger than it was at Rome's height. And we can also see here that while Rome is still a great cosmopolitan center at the end of the 4th century, as well as places like Alexandria, nevertheless, the imperial capitals have moved away from Rome. The emperors don't spend time there because there's no real military importance to Rome. Instead, they have to be closer to the frontiers. And so they are in places like Trier, which is in Germany now, Milan, which is the main Western capital at this point, Constantinople, as we've mentioned, the Eastern capital, and then Antioch, which is the great capital defending the Persian frontier in Syria. So in addition to this, as the empire is divided now, finally again, between Theodosius's sons, so his son Arcadius becomes the emperor in the east, and his son Honorius becomes the emperor of the west. This division isn't exactly equal. It sort of looks equal, but in fact, there's a little bit more frontier on the western side to have to defend, while simultaneously the west has poorer provinces. So North Africa is probably the richest, but in general, the richest provinces are over in the east, and especially Egypt, which is this huge, and has always been this huge provider of grain. So the east has more secure frontiers and smaller frontiers, and it also has this incredible asset in Constantinople, which is an incredibly defensible capital, especially compared to Milan, which is able to be besieged and taken, unlike Constantinople. So that's the setup as we're getting towards Justinian's time. So like I say, the Germanic tribes were fleeing the arrival of the Huns from the steppes, and the Visigoths, a Germanic confederation, crossed into the Balkans and crossed across the Danube. Theodosius I finally ended a war against the Visigoths on terms that were very favorable to the Visigoths. So they are recognized as federates or allies of Rome, but nevertheless, they're allowed to maintain lands and also autonomy, their own king, while nevertheless living on the Roman side of the Danube frontier. And so in a lot of ways, that concession kind of opens the gates to the idea that federates, that is, allies who are confederations that have their own kings and their own little armies, and as they run around within the empire's boundaries, that allows them that precedent to rule their own little kingdoms, essentially, within the frontiers of the empire. And so Germanic military federates and imperial authorities engaged then in a whole bunch of complicated power struggles that we don't have to go through the entire situation with the Visigoths, but essentially the Visigoths often fought on the side of the empire and helped out a lot against the Huns, for example, but they also didn't feel like they were getting the kind of recognition from imperial authorities, and they also wanted their own stable situation. So ultimately they moved from Thrace and the Balkans to Italy, and on the way sacking Rome, to the shock of everyone in the Western world, as Rome hadn't had that fate for 7 centuries. Before then, they finally established their own sort of autonomous kingdom in Aquitaine, that is southwestern France. And later, from that base in Aquitaine, they conquered Spain, Hispania. And while they were there, ultimately, because they had a better base now than Aquitaine, they lost Aquitaine eventually to the Franks, and they became focused entirely on Spain. So this federation is just one of the examples. So the Visigoths, their path was followed by additional Germanic confederations, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, the Burgundians, the Franks, and so forth. So the Western emperors had been in Milan, But because that wasn't as defensible a location, they created a new capital in Ravenna. So Ravenna is a little bit south of Venice, which is also coming to be founded, soon after this, in this kind of time frame, as a defense. So Ravenna at the time was sort of like a Venice. It was in the middle of a bunch of marshes and a set of islands. And so it was very hard to besiege. It was able to be kind of defended the way Venice has still been defensive because it has a lagoon around it. And so, and it also is on the coast, so they can immediately get support from the east, from Constantinople, if possible. So, nevertheless, the descendants of Theodosius the Great, that last emperor to rule the United Empire, his sons and his grandsons and other relatives that are his dynasty that follows, they're pretty incompetent. And during their reigns, real power kind of falls into the hands in the West of military leaders, in some cases, semi-barbarians like Stilicho, in some cases, Romans like Aetius, other Germans like Ricimer, and those leaders ultimately found it better, or good for them anyway, good for their interest, to allow kind of a short reigning figurehead nominal emperor on the throne of the West Roman Empire until finally the last of them, Odoacer, dispenses with the final kind of symbolic emperor, who's cutely known as Romulus Augustulus, who's deposed in 476. And so that's, sometimes equated as a traditional date for the fall of the West Roman Empire, in that after this there's no more West Roman emperors until the empire, the idea of empire, is revived by the Pope in 800 with Charlemagne. But on the other hand, a lot of other things don't actually change. Even though there's no emperor anymore, there's still a Senate. The people, but majority of the population still all think of themselves as Roman and follow Roman law. The kingdom now is a Germanic-led kingdom in Italy, and in the other places as well. But nevertheless, the land still consider themselves to be part of the Roman world, even though on the map we change how it's labeled. So Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths, who end up taking over Italy, invaded there and defeated Odoacer in 493, and Theodoric then made Ravenna, that last capital of the West Roman Empire, the capital of the Ostrogothic kingdom. So when we get to the end of Theodoric the Great's reign in 526, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, Burgundians, and the Franks had all established pretty stable kingdoms within the boundaries of what had been the West Roman Empire. And so the political map then, as it exists in 526, at the death of Theodoric, we can see kind of all of the arrows here as we see kind of the paths of all of these confederations as they finally make their way to where they end up. The ones that go the farthest in here are the Vandals, who end up creating a kingdom for themselves in what we now think of as Tunisia, what was then Carthage, Africa. Very, again, a rich Roman province. It's a great prize for the Vandals to get, and they're able to become a naval power as a result of that. And so they are able to start taking over the Western Mediterranean. The Visigoths or Westgoths make their way, as I said, ultimately to Spain as their heartland. The Franks eventually give their name to France, which is kind of where they are. They take Gaul. Southeastern Gaul is where the Burgundians set up. And then the Ostrogoths have Italy and also sort of all the way up to the Danube. So it means like Austria and Slovenia and Croatia and all of those areas in the Illyricum in the former Yugoslavia. And so next to that, though, very interestingly, a very stable East Roman Empire that continues to exist on the division line, even as all of this chaos has happened for over a century in the West. And so from the perspective of Constantinople in the early 500s, when Justinian is growing up, the Eastern Empire, almost looks like it always has, while the West seems to be wholly lost, given over to Franks and Visigoths, Ostrogoths and Vandals. And this presumably is how it looked to Justinian, who had a vision of turning back this clock. So that's kind of our beginning of our context of how we're getting there. We've done that sort of quickly geographically, but I thought I'd also show a timeline of how this fits together, because it's a little confusing. So we'll go on this timeline is going from a little bit before 400 is where we're starting to 600, and our focus, Justinian, his reign, Justinian I, his reign here is in the second quarter here of the 500s, second and third quarter, and that line across the top then is our line of Eastern emperors, beginning with Theodosius, that last emperor who briefly ruled East and West, then his dynasty in blue, Arcadius, and then Theodosius II for the Eastern Roman emperors, Honorius and Valentinian III, West Roman emperors. Then we get in the West there these nominal emperors as I say, these military leaders, Stilicho, Aetius, Ricimer, Odoacer, are the real powers, Odoacer being the one who deposes Romulus Augustulus, making himself king of Italy. Meanwhile, Odoacer is fighting against the Ostrogoths who come in, and Theodoric the Great has this great long reign where he's king of the Ostrogoths before conquering Italy and becoming king of Italy, and then continues to reign another quarter century. Then, unfortunately for the Ostrogoths, there's a series of later, less successful kings, less long reigning kings. And I would also just put on here Attila the Hun, just so that we can kind of see kind of the height of the Hunnic Empire and the pressure it was putting on there. And you can see it's pretty not coincidental that this is, as you're seeing this collapsing happen in the West at the same time. And then it's also really actually not coincidental that this collapse of the Ostrogoths is happening in Justinian's reign. And we'll look more at this, but essentially I'm also putting on here because the West emperors were in danger of losing power to their military leaders. There was always that threat with Justinian's generals because he was so focused on military matters but wasn't leading the troops himself. And so I'm also showing kind of the act when his generals Belisarius and Narses are active, and then the time period of the Italian Wars. Then the really devastating event also of Justinian's reign, the plague of Justinian, begins at 541. And so you can kind of see that context with that timeline. So let's look at Justinian himself. So Justinian was born in Teresium, which is a town in what is now North Macedonia. It's not clear, but he was a Roman peasant family, either Thraco-Roman or Illyro-Roman, probably born around 482. He was a native speaker of Latin, and he was likely, probably the last Roman emperor to be a native speaker of Latin. And that's one of the, I think, qualities that set him out when people are suggesting that he may be, in some sense, the last Roman emperor. I mean, in the sense that Latin had been pretty central to the language of the empire originally, then always of the West Empire. It's still, in this time period, the language of the army and administration. And so as Justinian is doing his law code, that's being compiled in Latin, despite the fact that natively almost everybody now in this, what's left of this empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, are Greek speakers, because in the Roman Empire at its height, the elite anyway were often bilingual, so they spoke both Latin and Greek. So Justinian, the Latin speaker. His uncle, Justin, adopted him, and hence he took the name Justinian, so that's the same kind of a model when you add that eon name, ending, eonis, ending on a Roman name in order to show adoption. So we talk about Caesar Augustus. He's the adopted son of Julius Caesar, and so he was originally called Octavius, and people called him Octavian because of that, means adopted, out of that name. He himself called himself Julius Caesar because he took that name because he's his son. But in any event, so Justinian here is adopted by his uncle, Justin, and Justin ultimately is the leader of the imperial bodyguard, or a unit of the imperial bodyguard, and so Justinian follows Justin into service as a member of the imperial bodyguard. The Eastern Roman Emperor at the time is Anastasius I, who dies childless. He has a bunch of relatives, but none of them immediately are put forward as a successor. Justin, has control of one of the biggest military forces as the bodyguard within the capital itself. And Justinian also helps his uncle get selected emperor by bribing rivals and also counselors. As usual, the populace of the empire, the Eastern Empire, were divided over Christology. I'd already got into Christology earlier in this, where I was talking about how the Vandals and the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths were all, the Burgundians are all Arians, which means that they think that Christ is a notch down from God the Father and is the first of God's creations. That is not the belief in the empire, but the empire is arguing still over Christology, and they're specifically really excited over this question of whether Christ has one or two natures. So does Christ have a nature that is human and divine, a single nature that has a combined, it's like gin and tonic together making one thing, or does he have two natures, a divine nature and a human nature that are always distinct, like oil and water? And so Anastasius has been a champion for something called Miaphysitism, which is a kind of a compromise between the two. So it's sort of halfway between monophysitism and diophysitism, one nature and two natures. And obviously people love compromises like that, right? So whenever you're making a theological compromise, it's the kind of thing that everyone hates. So people didn't like that. And so now Justin is a strict diophysite, which becomes the orthodoxy. And that's also the position that's favored in the West. So that's the position of the Pope. So Justinian continues to show energy and ambition during his uncle's reign. Justinian is one of the things he's renowned for, and one of the reasons why he's successful as an emperor is that he's kind of a workaholic, and so he's continuously putting in the time. He's not an emperor that's lazing around or wasting time. And under Emperor Justin, he serves as a consul, which is still a position of great honor in the empire. He's commander of the army in the East, and he's ultimately named other honors like nobilissimus and also named Caesar. And as a Caesar, then that means formally that he is his uncle's heir. And so we have a coin here that depicts both Justin I, who's ruling as the Augustus, and Justinian, who is his heir as the Caesar. And as Justin's health declined, he also began to show signs of senility. people charge that Justinian sort of began to function as a de facto ruler, and when his uncle died in 527, he assumed the throne as sole emperor. So while Justin was still alive and reigning, Justinian fell in love with a woman who had been a mime and an actress named Theodora. In Roman culture, actors were at a very low rung of the social ladder, which they were essentially akin to prostitutes, and Theodora is charged with having been a prostitute. And so therefore, this is a big social gap between that and the level of senatorial nobility. So even though Justinian had originally begun life as a peasant, he's now been elevated to, being a nobilissimus. He's at the very height of the social rung. But, and so he was barred then from being able to marry even an actor who has been reformed, or a prostitute who has been reformed. And so he convinces his uncle to pass a law that eliminates that, which then allowed Justinian to marry Theodora while his uncle was still emperor. Despite her background, when he came to the throne, Justinian had Theodora crowned Augusta, so giving her the title of empress, the highest empress title. And in one of his edicts, he describes Theodora as my partner in my deliberations. And so they do seem to have a very close and good working relationship in their life. So evidence of the partnership is also found in a very highly biased account that we're going to talk about, the account of Procopius, who is our major source for the whole reign of Justinian. And so he says in his Secret History, one of his 3 books that come down to us, that the empress participated in state council meetings and that she exercised a great degree of influence on Justinian. So let's talk about Procopius, since he's our major source for everything that we're going to talking about. We've been talking about and we'll talk about tonight. So in just reconstructing Justinian's reign, we have 3 major works by Procopius, who's a contemporary historian writing in Greek. He's born in Caesarea in Palestine, and he became an aide, a legal aide to Justinian's great general Belisarius. And so he is an eyewitness to lots of the different wars that he writes about. So he writes an 8-volume history called The History of the Wars that includes Justinian's Persian War, his Vandalic War, and his Gothic War, so his war against the Sassanines, the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths and Visigoths. And he also wrote a panegyric, which is a kind of a public praise, where you are talking about the topic of it is Justinian's many building projects throughout the empire. So not just Hagia Sophia, but Justinian is a great builder. We also have he completes the incredible church of San Vitale in Ravenna, and San Vitale serves as the model for Charlemagne's chapel in Aachen. So that panegyric by Procopius is called The Buildings. But even though the wars is probably the more important of the works, by far the more tantalizing and more famous work is Procopius's Secret History, in which he really tries to assassinate the characters of Justinian and Theodora. He has all kinds of lewd things to say about Theodora. If we only had his other books, his book on the wars, and also the panegyric about the buildings, we would really hardly expect that this Procopius, who otherwise seems to be like a mild-mannered official, we wouldn't imagine that he's harboring this invective, this incredible hatred for the subject of his writing, Justinian and Theodora. And so in the Secret History, he paints the imperial couple as the antithesis of good rulers. And so, like always, when we have limited sources, it's actually just even having all of this detail that we have about the wars, it gives us so much more than you normally would have if we don't have a source like this. But you just always are in this position with ancient history that you have to be considering the bias of the author, as we are reading what he's saying and what he's sharing with us, and having to decide, is this a gossip? Is this a slur? What is behind this? I read that assessment that he felt that Theodora had a lot of sway over Justinian and that she was invited to all the councils and things like that. Procopius took that as a negative slur to say that's a slur on Justinian's manhood, that this woman is controlling him or something like that. But it could reflect the importance of her counsel in their marriage and their partnership as Augustus and Augusta. So Procopius' invective is also probably an indication, I think, that many in the highly cultured Greek-speaking elite of Constantinople, that many of them looked at Justinian, who kind of was, like a rube probably from their perspective, a guy who's barely removed from Latin speaking peasant stock, and then Theodora, who's barely removed from being an actor or maybe being a prostitute, and they probably see them as very unworthy upstarts and are turning their nose up at them and that sort of thing. Here we have a city that has become, it's very cosmopolitan, but it's got a huge amount of gradations, and so the social classes would have been pretty fixed, and people would have been probably upset that there's this huge jump, to the top. And also that's reinforced by the fact that Justinian, as himself sort of a new man, also favors new men, that is, people who aren't born into nobility, but rather owe their rise to him, and so therefore are potentially loyal to him, and perhaps he can elevate people who are hardworking like him and maybe have skills and so forth. Not too happy for people who are part of a hereditary elite. So, though, in addition to that resentment from the elite, there's also some signs that early in the reign, especially, that Justinian was also unpopular with the commons. He introduced, some pretty substantial taxation, which is not anything anybody likes. And a lot of his officials that were in charge of collecting the taxes were very unpopular. And so in a event that sort of prefigures what we think of as maybe the different football revolutions in Latin America or other places, the residents of Constantinople had all become chariot racing fanatics. So one of the Hippodrome, this giant chariot racing stadium, dominated the city and was right at the heart, right next to the palace, very close to where the original Hagia Sophia was and Hagia Sophia is now. And there were all sorts of factions, with the leading factions being the Blues and the Greens. But then in the year 532, both factions united and began to riot against Justinian, trying to depose him and also, if possible, replace him with Hypatius, who is a nephew of the former emperor Anastasius. So again, there's going to always be these kinds of factions, and so in the same way that maybe initially, there's Miaphysites and who are not happy with the elimination of Miaphysitism, as Justinian is a Diophysite. People remember the good old times. Anybody who had reason to dislike what Justinian and Theodora join in with the carnival of this riot trying to replace him. Because the fans in the chariot racing usually shouted Nika, which means victory or win kind of thing. The riots become called the Nika riots, as they're running around shouting that all the time. Justinian quickly lost control of the situation. Tens of thousands of rioters took control of the hippodrome. There were fires all over the city that ultimately end up destroying half the city, including the original or the earlier Great Basilica, Hagia Sophia, before the one that Justinian builds. So at a certain point, all seems lost, and Justinian considers fleeing into exile, according to Procopius, so we have to take it with a grain of salt. But according to that source, he was talked out of leaving by Theodora. And so in sort of a famous quote that Procopius puts in her mouth, she says, "In my opinion, flight is not the right course, even if it should bring us to safety. It's impossible for a person having been born into this world not to die." So we're all going to die at some point. "But for one who has reigned, it is intolerable to be a fugitive. May I never be deprived of this purple robe," the color of being an empress, "and may I never see the day when those who meet me do not call me empress. If you wish to save yourself, my lord, there is no difficulty. We are rich, over there is the sea, and yonder are the ships. We can get out of here. You can get out of here if you want. Yet reflect a moment whether, when you have once escaped to a place of security, you would not gladly exchange such a safety for death. As for me, I agree with the adage that royal purple is the noblest shroud. So she's going to stay and fight even if they end up dying. That stiffens Justinian's resolve. He's able to gather the men that he has left with him and use military force to attack and suppress the rioters. And Procopius says that results in the death of some 30,000 civilians. And so again, half the city's been destroyed and lots of people have all been killed. So, like I say, one of the buildings destroyed was the previous Hagia Sophia, and that was the second one actually. Both of the earlier two had been built on the model of a Roman basilica. And so it would have been like any one of the great Constantinian churches in Rome. That would have been, old St. Peter's, which was also destroyed in order to build new St. Peter's. But St. John Lateran, St. Mary Majoris, and St. Paul Beyond the Walls are still all with us. And so these incredible giant 4th century structures that have a tall center and then these side aisles, but are essentially go, as a long rectangle. The destruction of that building allows Justinian to remake the capital according to his own vision, including building a new Hagia Sophia on this completely different plan, which is just this incredibly elevated, enormous dome surrounded by these other half-partial domes, which is able to enclose a space that isn't long and skinny, but is instead incredibly tall and voluminous. And that's the edifice that continues to this day and also ends up forming the model for pretty much later Byzantine construction, and indeed after that for Muslim, especially Turkish construction. So while Justinian is rebuilding Constantinople, he also perhaps begins to envision a more grand rebuilding project, which is the renovation of the empire itself by reclaiming the lost provinces of the West. And so, again, he's got the East Roman Empire still pretty much intact, and we have the Western Empire that has fallen and is now divided among the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths. So, although, like I say, coloring changes on modern historical maps, the elimination of the last nominal Western emperors did not really mean that suddenly the majority of all Western Romans instantly ceased thinking of themselves as Romans. So each of those kingdoms has a small warrior class that forms the leadership of the kingdom. But underneath that is the vast majority of all the people that are still consider themselves Romans and are still living by Roman law. And so Germanic leaders are building on their tradition that they already had, where they are federates or allies of the Rome. And once there's no more Western emperor, they look to Constantinople and they seek to receive recognition, titles, honors, sometimes being bribes and such from Eastern Roman emperors. And so then nominally, they end up receiving titles like Theodoric, who's given from the Eastern emperor the title patrician. So they end up nominally being the lieutenants, in the fiction that the Roman Empire is all still intact in the West, and now they are simply ruling in the name of the emperor over this part of it. And that's, I say nominally, because de facto, they don't have to obey anything. There's nothing that has caused them to follow the edicts of Constantinople. They're effectively independent, but nominally this has been maintained, and sometimes nominally can continue to keep a door open. Theodoric has largely been ruling as a Roman leader. He's calls himself king of the Goths and the Romans, and he is thoughtful of his Roman subjects, and he works closely also with the Roman elite in Italy. And as I say, Romans are still subject to Roman law. In Ravenna, in part of the palace complex that he builds, there's all of these, very contemporary, modern, we think of as Byzantine mosaics, but mosaics in the contemporary Roman style. And this one has an image of the palace that Theodoric built. And originally, there would have been pictures probably of Theodoric and then all of his officials in all of those columns. And when the Byzantines, or when Justinian the East Romans took this palace complex, they would have ripped out the images of the Ostrogoths, and then they covered them over instead with these curtains. And you can tell that because in front of the columns, you can still see the people's little hands that are still not been replaced because they didn't replace the columns. So this is an image of the palace that Theodoric builds, which was modeled on the great palace in Constantinople. So he is trying to continue to have the empire live on, with now himself as the head of it in Italy. And one of the other things that's so interesting is that he is able to complete still these major building projects. So this is that basilica that includes that mosaic that I was just showing, that is part of the palace complex that Theodoric builds in 505. It's incredibly impressive, and actually between what Theodoric created and then what Justinian and his successors create when they take back control of Ravenna, spoiler alert if we haven't gotten there yet, is that there's more mosaics here, and all of these buildings and churches and everything like that, palaces, are more intact in Ravenna by far than anything that exists in Istanbul. Because throughout most of the rest of the Eastern Empire, it all eventually, when they went through an iconoclasm where they didn't like images for a while, and then they also, it all eventually got conquered by Muslims for a while. There were still, in some cases, and the Muslims are also iconoclastic, and so they also destroy images. And so almost all of these incredible mosaics, they're preserved best. The best set of them are in Ravenna rather than anywhere in the East. So, but this is part of a program that, despite the fact that, the Western Empire has fallen, as we say, nevertheless, the apparatus of the state under Theodoric, under the Ostrogoths, is still able to produce these major civic works projects that otherwise, when we get into the later Middle Ages, or the next phase of the Middle Ages in the West, that's not going to be possible again for centuries. An example is Theodoric's mausoleum, which is, the top of that is a concrete dome. It's just a giant structure, and super heavy, the dome. And so it's a very interesting artifact. Under Theodoric, under the Ostrogoths, the Roman Senate in Rome continued to exist, and Theodoric brought members of the senatorial elite into his government. Theodoric continued to name consuls. So we mentioned that as an impressive honor that dates all the way back to the Republic, even if doesn't have the power that it had back in the time of the Republic. And Theodoric's consuls were recognized by Justinian's father, Justin I, as the emperor in Constantinople. And Theodoric was able in 519 to name his son-in-law and heir, so an Ostrogoth, Eutharic, to be consul. So the Ostrogothic elite is, in that sense, merging with Roman honors and being recognized by the Eastern Roman emperors. Among the elite, the Roman philosopher Boethius, who is from a high senatorial family, who goes on to author the incredible book, one of the top works of literature, The Consolation of Philosophy. Boethius served as Theodoric's master of offices, that is to say, the head of the civil government, not quite a prime minister, but kind of like it, before he was executed ultimately on suspicion of conspiring with Constantinople to maybe do what Justinian ultimately did, which is invade and take Italy back over under direct rule, which it's not clear if Boethius was guilty or not, but he might have been. So in any event, that didn't poison the relationship entirely, because Boethius was replaced by another influential Roman patrician, Cassiodorus. Cassiodorus, ultimately, when he retired, he has an incredibly important legacy, which includes creating an educational curriculum for the West throughout the Middle Ages, which was able to popularize teaching liberal arts, the 7 liberal arts, the trivium and the quadrivium, which kind of is the basis for education then for many, many centuries. And so, and again, these are both guys are both living after the fall of the West Roman Empire, and yet they have incredible access still to the ancient libraries. Boethius is still fully fluent in Greek, and he's actually engaged in a huge program to translate all of Aristotle from Greek into Latin. And if he'd been able to go, instead of getting executed, if he'd been able to go live off in a monastery, it would have been an amazing thing for the West to have been able to have access to all of that, because very soon, within a couple centuries, as we look ahead to the next phase of the Middle Ages, the knowledge of Greek is largely lost in the West, and the access to books like that, they don't have libraries like this, even though books are preserved because of people like Cassiodorus, who get people to preserve books in monasteries and things like that. Cassiodorus' successors. Anyway, and so it does end up being something, but they don't have the wealth of this like still exists under the Ostrogoths. So in a sense, therefore, Justinian's task was, despite what the map looks like, it's not to conquer foreign kingdoms, but actually to transform nominal authority as Roman emperor who has a delegated patricius or something like that, to actually have it become real authority. So by the time Justinian gets around to it, such a thing wouldn't have been possible. So when Theodoric is ruling in Italy, he's simply too powerful, and that's also true for the founder of the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, Genseric. But by the time Justinian gets around to it, by the time for him, Fortunately for him, these strong kings have died, leaving much weaker successors. Kind of in both cases, they are strong warlord kings who then kind of becoming Roman emperor-like kings, people who are merged with a Roman elite. They train their own sons to be philosophers and things like that, and they are less able to be kind of the warlords that are still needed. So Genseric's grandson, Hilderic, ascended the Vandal throne in 523. So on his mother's side, Hilderic was actually descended from the West Roman Emperor Valentinian III. So a couple daughters ultimately marry into the Vandal royal house. And so therefore, Hilderic actually has then both Vandal royal blood and imperial Roman blood, that last great dynasty. So Hilderic initiates in the Vandal kingdom a very pro-Constantinople policy. And part of that was steps of getting away from Arianism, this Christological alternative that the Germanic tribes are committed to. And he starts to move towards Chalcedonianism, that is to say the Nicene understanding of the Trinity. And included in that is appointing Chalcedonian Nicene bishops. So him doing all of this alarms kind of conservative Vandals who want to maintain, their independence and their distinctiveness. And a group of those led by Hilderic's cousin Gelimer overthrows then and imprisons him in the year 530. So the leader of that coup, Gelimer, takes the throne then, restores Arianism to the official religion of the Vandal kingdom, sets about reversing all of those reforms, which causes then Justinian to, and he imprisons his cousin, the former king that's deposed. Justinian then sends envoys to Carthage protesting Gelimer's actions, and he orders the restoration of Hilderic. Gelimer's like, well, what are you talking about? You don't have the authority to do that, Justinian. I'm the king of the Vandals. We're an independent kingdom. So he is dispensing with that nominal overlordship that he's ruling supposedly on behalf of the emperor in Constantinople when he doesn't like what the emperor of Constantinople says. And that, of course, gives Justinian the pretext that he wants, because he actually just would like to get rid of the Vandals altogether. And so, like I say, armed with that pretext that Gelimer now, who is on the throne in Carthage, is a usurper, and he's refused the orders of this rightful overlord in Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Emperor, Justinian is now ready to set his sights on the Vandal kingdom. There's only one problem. Unfortunately, Justinian has inherited from his uncle, one of the other things that he's inherited from his uncle is a costly and inconclusive war with an enemy that is actually much more important and more formidable, and that is the Persian Empire, Rome's historic rival to the east, another great established state empire. When Rome was at its height, the dynasty that was ruling over the Persian Empire, the Parthians, in general were a weaker adversary. In the year 224, however, Ardashir I overthrew the Parthians and established the Sasanian Empire. And the Sasanians more actively looked back on the legacy of those original Persians, the Achaemenids, who had ruled that first great world empire that not only included Persia and Iraq, but also Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, and even Thrace, in other words, the place where Constantinople even was, that had been ruled by the Achaemenid Persians before Alexander conquered it all. And so these Sasanian Persians had claims on East Roman territory, and they remembered that. And part of the issue is that in addition to the Sasanians being a stronger empire than the Parthians had been, obviously Rome has lost half of its empire, so it's weaker than it has been as standing off against them. So when one of the Sasanian king of kings, Kaved I, who had been prosecuting this war against Justinian's uncle, Justin, when he dies in 531, he's succeeded by his son, Khosrow I. Justinian took the opportunity to negotiate with him what is billed as a perpetual or eternal peace between Persia and the East Roman Empire in the year 532. So Khosrow agrees to a peace if you give me 11,000 pounds of gold. And so that so he's bought off with just an enormous amount of money. And so it's actually a testament to the ongoing function of the East Roman Empire that they're able to collect that kind of tribute money in order to buy off the Sasanians, to buy off the Persians. But that being done and the payment being given, peace is bought on that frontier, which allows Justinian to turn his attention to the west. So Justinian appoints his general, Belisarius, to command a great expedition to North Africa. It consists of some 92 dromons, or kind of galley warships, and those are escorting another 500 transports that are filled with 1,500 soldiers. So this is not something that the Vandals were expecting at all. They're caught completely by surprise. Nevertheless, they're not just immediately wiped out. This is a strong kingdom, and they might have been able to eke it out, but that didn't quite work out. So they are defeated in major battles in the year 533, Decimum and Ticamarum, and Belisarius then takes Carthage. Gelimer flees for a while, but ultimately surrenders, and so the Vandal kingdom is effectively decapitated very rapidly. This potentially gives Justinian a new problem. So the Roman Empire really has never corrected its succession issue. So there are dynasties that are able to be established, and emperors born in the purple are more legitimate than ones that aren't. Although again, Justinian wasn't born in the purple; he was a adopted son of the previous emperor who didn't really have any imperial background before that. So since, though, being a military commander, an imperator, a general, was the emperor's original or most important role, they were always in danger of being usurped if there was a successful general. And so as Belisarius' reputation continues to improve when he does things like destroy the Vandal kingdom, there's a chance that maybe he will be acclaimed emperor by his own troops and come back and depose Justinian. Some of the people who didn't like Belisarius in his expedition wrote back kind of gossipy notes that he was planning to make himself king of Africa after he destroys the Vandals, that he'll just stay there and be king himself, which causes Justinian to recall him home. So Belisarius comes back to Constantinople. He brings back with him the captured king of the Vandals, and they've also been able to capture the treasury of the Vandal kingdom, which is very vast indeed. The Vandals had sacked Rome and had also exacted tributes. So as a result, Belisarius is awarded the honor of a triumph, and you might remember these going all the way back as a tradition to the Roman Republic. This is the kind of thing that Gaius Marius or Sulla or Pompey, Caesar are awarded these triumphs when they defeat a major enemy. So Caesar conquering Gaul, Pompey Syria, and Scipio Africa, and so forth. They would have a big parade where they have all of the captives, including the kings that have been captured, and also all of the loot that they have. And so this is the very first time that they celebrate a triumph in Constantinople since it's founded. And also, for the most part, ever since Augustus has taken over the empire and they made it into an empire, a hidden empire, the republic, the forms of the republic are preserved. Nevertheless, private citizens aren't given this honor because it's too close to imperial power. And so it's only emperors who have been celebrating triumphs. And so now Belisarius has one of these. And so Procopius describes this amazing event. He says, there was booty. First of all, whatever articles are wont to be set apart for royal service. So thrones of gold and carriages in which it is customary for a king's consort to ride, and much jewelry made of precious stones and golden drinking cups, and all other things which are useful for the royal table. And there was also silver weighing many thousands of talents, and all the royal treasure amounting to an exceedingly great sum. And among these were the treasures of the Jews, which Titus, the son of Vespasian, together with certain others, had brought to Rome after the capture of Jerusalem. So we know from the Arch of Titus, we have this depiction of the triumph that Titus celebrated after they destroyed Jerusalem, that includes like the menorah from the destroyed temple of Herod. And so apparently on their probably when they sacked Rome, the Vandals had grabbed that treasure and brought it with them to Carthage, and now this has been recaptured or captured now by the East Romans. And there were slaves in the triumph. Among the slaves was Gelimer himself, wearing some sort of a purple garment upon his shoulders, and all his family, and as many as the Vandals as were a very tall and a fair of body. And when Gelimer reached the hippodrome and saw the emperor sitting upon a lofty seat and the people standing on either side, and he realized as he looked about what an evil plight he was, he neither wept nor he cried out, but he ceased not saying over and over the words of the Hebrew scripture, quoting Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And that's an interestingly philosophical quote for Gelimer to be pulling out of the most philosophical book of the Old Testament, that is the reflection of, ostensibly the reflection of King Solomon at the end of his life, how it doesn't really matter, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair, none of this matters, everything is vain. And so that's his reflection. When the Vandal king came before the emperor's seat, they stripped off the purple garment and compelled him to fall prone on the ground and do obeisance to the emperor Justinian. This also Belisarius did. And so Belisarius is make sure here that he's not trying to usurp Justinian as being a suppliant of the emperor along with him. So all this treasure and also the recovery of what had been one of the richest provinces in the West was the most lucrative and successful of Justinian's Western interventions, and it might have given him a sense, this whole restoration of the empire thing, is going to be easier than he might have first thought. Nevertheless, in terms of recovering a valuable province, they're able to get Africa and keep it. But even though the Vandals were all suppressed and gotten rid of, they had more difficulty bringing indigenous Mari, the Berbers and so on, under their control. So the people who had always been there, even when the Phoenicians had arrived, they continued fighting, maintaining their independence from the renewed East Roman authority until 548. And so that warfare caused significant damage to the province, what had remained of the legacy from the West Roman Empire, the cities, the infrastructure, and so forth, agricultural lands. So now Justinian is able to turn his sights onto the big prize, the Ostrogoths and Italy, and ultimately Rome itself. Another dynastic dispute gives him the pretext to invade the Ostrogothic kingdom. So a guy named Theodahad usurped the throne, And he then imprisons and ultimately has assassinated Theodoric the Great's daughter, Queen Amalasuintha, in the year 535. She had been ruling as a regent for her son who died, and then she was sort of ruling, and now she's been deposed and assassinated, and so now there's a usurper. Same kind of thing that Justinian likes to intervene about. He has Belisarius cross into Italy from Sicily at the head of a Roman invasion force. Ultimately, Belisarius's force is joined by a second force under the command of Narses, another general. This one is an Armenian eunuch. So probably at this point, Justinian is weary or leery of wanting, Belisarius to have too much power if he just conquers everything all the time, and so wants to maybe divide command and also glory among other generals. Nevertheless, the fact that there is a confused command structure ends up hampering the progress of the campaign. And over the course of this, it becomes very destructive. So the Roman forces take control, for example, of Milan. And Milan has been the second largest, it had been a capital before, but it was the second largest city in the Roman city in Italy after Rome itself. And while, as the Ostrogoths are taking it back, it ends up having to eventually fall and capitulate. And when that happens, the Ostrogoths raze it to the ground and depopulate it entirely. So it's a huge loss to what had been, a West Roman city that had continued to exist even after the fall, so-called, of Rome and the Ostrogothic kingdom. Now that's wiped out. Ultimately, Belisarius is confirmed in command, and he ends up marching on the Ostrogothic capital, Ravenna. This would be pretty hard to besiege again because it's in this marsh and has all of this water defenses and so forth. But he gets a golden opportunity. The Ostrogoths want him to switch sides, and they promise that he can be their leader. They will recognize him as the West Roman emperor if he essentially changes sides and becomes their emperor against Justinian. So Belisarius feigns agreement with them, which is able to then negotiate his way into the city. And then once he and his army are in there, he betrays them and reclaims it for the East Roman Empire. He continues to be loyal to Justinian. And so with the fall of Ravenna, that sort of seems like the Ostrogothic kingdom is wrapped up. And just as that seemed to be happening, the King of Kings back in Persia takes that opportunity to break that eternal, perpetual peace, and he decides to invade, cross the frontier, invade Roman Syria, and he's able to sack that great eastern metropolis of Antioch. I think they've had an earthquake that has damaged their walls, and it makes it easy to get in there. There's from a different historical time period, there's a phrase, I think it's by Kipling, that once you've paid the Danegeld, which was what the Anglo-Saxon kings had to pay off the Vikings, the Danish Vikings, you have to pay them big tribute to make them go away. But once you've paid the Danegeld, he says, you'll never get rid of the Danes. So the Danes want to come back and get more gold. So Justinian has to recall Belisarius and a bunch of the army to refocus now on the Persian threat, although, again, may be worried that Belisarius is going to be too powerful, so ultimately he sends him back to Italy. But a lot of focus now has to be had fighting the Sasanians, which divides the East Roman Empire's capacity. And really on and off for the next 2 decades, Khosrow I continues to have a pretty destructive war where it goes back and forth with both sides until he again agrees to a peace treaty. But this time, the terms of the treaty are the Romans are going to have to pay him 500 pounds of gold every year, so an annual tribute of 30,000 solidi in order to not to attack. So, meanwhile, while the cat was away in Italy, the fortunes of the Ostrogoths revived. They ended up getting a series of new kings, especially Totila, who reigns for a last decade, during which time he's fighting a war with the East Romans. And as the war drags on, really much of what remains of Roman Italy is destroyed or damaged as the fighting goes back and forth. The city of Rome even changes hands just multiple times. So it falls to the Romans, then it falls back, taken back by the Ostrogoths, and in the meantime, lots of it gets ruined and depopulated. And if that wasn't enough, all of these decades of destructive warfare in the West, beginning in the year 541, when we look back at that timeline I was mentioning, the empire, along with all their neighbors, including the Sasanians, suffer one of the most deadly epidemics in European history, sort of a precursor of the Black Death from the 14th century, the calamitous 14th century. Procopius estimates that the plague killed 1/5 of the population of Constantinople. Both Procopius and Justinian catch it and recover, but it is rare to recover. The plague, again, further weakens the reclaimed western provinces and has knock-on effects throughout the empire in terms of economy, the power, workforce power for all of the economy, much less recruiting fresh troops and all of that kind of thing. And so when we see this map in the historical atlas, when I was looking at maps like this as a little kid, you don't see everything that's underneath all of the colors. It just, as far as you know, it could be the Roman Empire is back, just like it had been under Augustus. But ultimately, while Justinian was successful in destroying the Vandal kingdom, the Ostrogothic kingdom, and he also, we didn't go into it, but he also was able to get a foothold in Spain, weakening the Visigoths. But at the same time, a lot of all of the ongoing traditions, the elites, the cities, things that had survived the nominal fall of the Western Empire, but had continued to exist, as it had been to whatever extent the population was able to. The Senate, Roman law, Roman people, Roman cities, a lot of infrastructure. The capacity of kings like Theodoric to build giant Roman-style public works projects. The capacity of Roman scholars like Boethius and Cassiodorus to continue to participate in the full breadth of the classical inheritance. All of that now is not here anymore. So now, instead of having new, let's say, core provinces, we now have new poor frontier provinces that are hardly paying what their garrisons cost. And so, with the exception of Africa, which is they're probably doing okay with, Italy and Spain are not really as valuable as what they might have hoped when you have this idea of restoring Rome. And 3 years after Justinian's death, depleted Italy and the few soldiers that they have left to garrison this province, again, it falls prey to one last Germanic confederation that makes their way into Italy. So the Lombards began a new invasion. And so you can see the orange is what they ultimately take, including even they contest the pink part, which is Ravenna, the Exarchate, the capital area of the revived province of East Roman Italy. And so the bulk of the Lombard kingdom is established up in the north, what we now think of as Lombardy. The Lombards give their name to this. Just outside Milan, which had been the capital, the city of Pavia is made the capital of the Lombard kingdom, and then kind of cut off from the north by this little thin line between the Exarchate and Rome, these little territories that are still clinging to being part of the Eastern Roman territory, sort of semi-independent duchies. Spoleto and Benevento are also little Lombard states that ultimately become de facto independent. So while Constantinople then clings on to Ravenna, Rome, other coastal outposts like Naples and Gaeta, Amalfi, Venice, the little tips of the toe in the boot, Calabria, which actually moves its location from where it used to be name-wise, from heel to toe. Nevertheless, the Lombards conquer the lion's share of Italy. And because they don't conquer the whole thing, Italy then becomes disunified all the way up until the end of the 19th century with Italian reunification. So that brings us back to, kind of that spoiler I gave right after we talked about Justinian's accomplishments, that when we just get half a century ahead, what the blue here is just, this is the bits that's left of the East Roman Empire, what's now really going to be called the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine being the name by historians, Byzantine being, the name of Constantinople, Istanbul, before it becomes Constantinople. And so that is to say the empire centered on Byzantium, on Constantinople. And what's left essentially is an Anatolian heartland, East Thrace, the province of Africa, the one kind of staying power that Justinian, was able to keep. And then you see otherwise little bits and pieces of the coast and so on. And this, of course, it is obviously not a refoundation on a stable footing when Justinian does it, to have then lost all of this. Now the Persians had to, in order to conquer, at this point just very temporarily, Syria and Egypt, they also had to exhaust themselves in the war against the East Roman Empire. And at this moment, when we get to this low point, what's going to happen is there is going to be a new refounder, an Emperor Heraclius, who is able to take this last rump and reform everything, mortgage everything, strip the churches, invest in a new army, reconquer back Syria and Egypt, and hit a devastating blow to the Persian Empire. And again, this is a transition moment where we really have a very different non-Latin Greek empire after this, that Heraclius revives. That leaves both of these empires incredibly exhausted right at the moment then that Islam emerges out of the desert. And so that is the future legacy that Justinian wasn't aware of when he got going. But you can't sometimes blame, you can't blame historical figures in some ways for not knowing what's going to happen in the future. But what I think you can blame Justinian for is, by his dreaming about the past, by his focus on the West, when he is in an empire that is actually, its capital is actually in the East, and by taking his eye off the ball of the Persians just continuously, I think that he put the empire that he'd inherited on a weaker footing than otherwise he might have. And so that's my take on how Justinian destroyed Rome in order to save it. So I'm going to grab some water as Leandro compiles your comments and questions. Okay, well, I want to thank folks for support. Thanks to JM and to Fire Ever Living and to Dave Anderson. Appreciate that. Winston Barquez says, is it more accurate to say that natural calamities of 536 AD did more to ruin the empire than did Justinian? And so, it's always, so I'm not necessarily, claiming that, I did kind of give a sum up where I said that Justinian took his eye off the ball of the Persians. And it also isn't, in some ways when I'm actually accusing him of destroying Rome in order to save it, I'm actually sort of not only talking about ruining the empire, I'm actually talking about ruining a Romanitas, a way of being Roman that had continued to exist in Africa and Italy, that he then wiped out or helped wipe out with those conquests. And so it was not only I'm not sure that he ruined the empire. I think that the empire was able to continue. The East Roman Empire was able to continue, and maybe, if things had worked out, having recovered Latin speakers, we would never be talking about Byzantine empires and so on, because it would all have more continuity with the complete Roman Empire. But really, once the East Roman Empire is fully cut off from Latin speakers after Heraclius, and it's a fully Greek empire, it's a cosmopolitan empire still, but the elite is focused on the Greek population, it really starts to, even though it has continuity, it is still a Roman Empire. It has changed an awful lot at that point. And so I don't think that Justinian ruined it, and the natural calamities had a huge cause, but it's like the plague of Justinian. But it's hard to know. It's hard to know exactly what the natural, how much to assign to natural calamities. So there are people who argue this is really the thing that caused the death blow, and then there are others that say, it just only had limited effects. It really affected some of the cities, but it wasn't as big a deal for the overall economy, and so it is harder to argue precisely the level of the effect of the natural calamities. But yeah, some people say so, and maybe so. Magi Mike, thank you for your support. I'm confused, Arthur Rama says, what did Justinian do that angered the factions in the Hippodrome? So there are a lot of things that they were upset about. So it wasn't really anything that he did, I think, during the sporting event. It's when you're having a sporting event that brings a whole mass of the people together, and they all decide at that point that they are upset at a lot of things, a lot of policies that Justinian has been having, including raising more taxes, being stronger at enforcing the tax raising, less loopholes and things like that. People never like taxes. There's just a host of other kinds of things that different people are upset about, and once a massive riot breaks out, you're saying, we're really not satisfied with this guy. We didn't ever think that Justin and Justinian really are cut from the purple. There are these upstarts, maybe, and again, some of them are looking to, restore the previous imperial family, somebody who has more nobility in them, maybe, and maybe there's also people who are worried about or upset about the religious policy. There's all of these different kinds of factors why everybody all starts rioting and wants to revolt, but it's not necessarily anything that happens in the chariot race. Zoper Xplex says, could it be said that Gaul, Iberia, Britain, North Africa, west of Egypt were to Rome what the third world is to the developed world today with regards to the center of wealth and power structure? So if we're talking about before, what we talk about the fall, so if we're talking about at the time of Theodosius the Great, the answer is no. They would have been they're good provinces. They've been part of the empire, for 400 years or more, and in some cases, like Italy or whatever Rome Republic that exists long before that. And so they're very developed. And I was just suggesting that when you are looking at the overall, as an empire, the overall wealth that you can soak out of a province, Egypt just has this incredible capacity to make grain, and at the time, and also because the Nile is a perpetual source of water, it's not reliant on, there could be places where you have a big drought and everything, and then there's famine, whereas the Nile, continuously comes whether they don't need rain. They're getting it from wherever the Nile comes from, as far as the Romans are concerned, the mountains of the moon. And so those, I'm just saying, relatively, the East is richer than the West, but it's not that. It's not. I wouldn't use that kind of comparison between the developing world and the developed world. In terms of wealth and power structure, also power structure, the Western capitals, Milan and Trier, were also central to the imperial court all the way up through that time, and so they were very developed. And Rome was an incredibly developed cosmopolitan center, and so there was. In a huge city, all the way up through kind of when these wars happen, when its population starts to go into a lot more decline. Michael Luce says, is there a relation between Hagia Sophia and a pantheon that you're calling it Agrippa's pantheon? The plan seems similar. This is Hadrian's joke. It says on the Pantheon, on the front of the Pantheon, it says, Marcus Agrippa may fake it. So in other words, Marcus Agrippa made me. But that is because that little Roman temple style, Greek temple style facade in front, that was an earlier Pantheon that Marcus Agrippa had built. The rest, all of that except for the front, has been wiped out, and Hadrian has made this domed structure. It's a different. I think again, this is a part of the Roman technology of domes, but Hagia Sophia is a different kind of dome. So it is definitely higher. The Pantheon is a concrete dome. I'm trying to think about. I don't know all the details of it, but it is part of the development of Roman architecture, and the fact that they're both domes makes them somewhat related. But domes in the West, this is not something that people continued to build lots and lots of domed structures based on the Pantheon. Whereas in the East, the system that they developed for building Hagia Sophia, that they then copy by making lots of similar ones that are smaller. But yeah, it would have been a precursor. Hadrian's domed Pantheon is a precursor. That's one of, as Romans are developing dome technology. Cobalt George, by this logic, wouldn't France be the most Roman of the medieval cultures since Justinian never subjugated them? So yes, it's in part true that, because, and in fact, there's a lot of things that survived in France because of that, and interestingly, it's interesting actually the amount of survival that medieval French nobles and things like that are still using all kinds of Roman terms, and so survival of Roman culture in France is actually one of the interesting inheritances of early medieval France. There's also lots of survival still in Italy, even though it doesn't. Both places, France and Italy and Spain, they all lose the capacity to build large public work structures. So they just aren't able to do things like major palaces and giant aqueducts and all that kind of thing. And so there is a decline even though the French weren't. The Franks, the Gauls, weren't subjugated by Justinian. Michael Luz, I feel that without the plague destroying 30% of the empire, the restoration could have still worked. What do you think? Yeah, I mean, it's a really bad break for that to happen right at that moment. On the other hand, one of the major challenges that the empire was having was with the Persians, the Sasanians, and they also lost they also got hit really hard by that plague. So it didn't hit the Romans uniquely, the East Romans uniquely. So I'm not sure. I think that you have this nostalgia because you remember an empire that extended all the way to the west, and part of the issue, though, once you move a capital, now you have to look at where you are now and what's the most strategic thing that you're worried about now. And so when I was talking about how splitting the empire, how the East had more compact frontiers, you lose that once you recapture the whole West, and now the capital is way out of whack for where the whole empire would be. So in the same way, when in Islam, when the original caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate, when they had their capital in Syria, they're much more focused on trying to conquer Constantinople. And it's later with the Abbasids that when they move it to Baghdad, now they're really not as much thinking about that, because you've moved and now you have a focus that's further east. And so then you kind of immediately start losing Western provinces like Spain and North Africa and so forth as their focus shifts. Just kind of inevitable because of the capacity of an ancient empire or a medieval empire to be able to, to exert power at a distance. Prashant Sharma, if America were to learn one lesson from this historical period, should it perhaps give up on the West or Europe, the past, and create a new Pacific empire? Well, the United States has recently given up its entire empire within the last, just this year. So, this idea, the U.S. it hasn't given up entirely, but by withdrawing from all of its alliances, but by withdrawing from its trade, hegemony, this kind of things, the U.S.'s soft, and it's not always soft, kind of hard empire that it had hegemony over the planet has now receded very rapidly, and so. It's not, the empires don't exist in the same way as they existed in the past, because it's not all about moving a frontier and owning more territory. This has been a revival of things that Vladimir Putin decided he wanted to do, which was just an insane backward idea of what to do. He already has, as a dictator of Russia, he already has like more land than he could ever want that's not used and undeveloped. The last thing he needs is more of that, and at the cost of destroying all the rest of his economy and everything else. So this is not the same kind of. We're in a completely different world than the kind of world that is existing in an ancient agricultural. 90% plus of the population is engaged in agriculture kind of economy. Fire Ever Living. Do we know why Justin the First preferred Diophysitism? I don't know that we know that, in the sense that he has a kind of a common background. Maybe it's because they're Latins. So. This is definitely the position that the Latin West has. So the popes and the Westerners are all Diophysites, and they're less argumentative about it than the Easterners, because they have to have all of these Greek terms translated for them into Latin, and they don't get it usually. And so maybe he just didn't. Maybe he just, anyway, maybe he inherited that view. I mean, I don't know that he was a very sophisticated thinker. He's not a sophisticated thinker, and so he's probably something that he's inherited. Michael Engel, are the architects of Hagia Sophia known? What technology allowed for its construction and innovations? I'd have to do a whole bunch of research on it for that. I got kind of the limits of my my knowledge of it when I was trying to talk about how how the pantheon is a lot different from Hagia Sophia. I guess what I do know is that that the idea of it is that it's built onto these 4 giant pillars, which are these giant supports that have then buttressing that allows like enormous weight that would also be pushing the columns apart and tending to spread everything, that those are all pushed back together because the whole structure is constantly buttressing itself in. And so it's an innovation that has allowed them to, build the dome resting up very high, because then underneath it there are, these additional semi-domes that are part of the buttressing that's keeping that all together. And so it's a very interesting innovation that allows them to build a big dome much higher up. Kinetic says, as the Byzantine Empire is a continuation of the East Roman Empire, are Byzantine priority New Testament manuscripts in fact Roman manuscripts? Byzantine priority New Testament manuscripts. I'm not sure what you mean by...
The 2 traditions of manuscript, like the Alexandria manuscripts, which is the more scholarly accepted one, and then the Byzantium or Byzantine manuscripts.
Yeah. So we have, our earliest manuscripts of the New Testament are predate this. So they go back to, the best ones that we have go back to Constantine's time. And so we have lots of very early, it doesn't go back to the initial authors, but we have very early manuscripts of, like the Codex Vaticanus, the Codex Sinaiticus, these early 4th century New Testament manuscripts. And then what happens is, then there's a continual ongoing textual tradition, and so that's that goes on in Byzantium, and then in the West. So in the West they get translated. So we have the Jerome and the Vulgate, because again Jerome has access to all of these early manuscripts. Even though it's a Latin translation, it's actually preserving a good early tradition. As the copies and copies degrade over time in the Greek tradition, it's still a witness to a very early tradition. And so the part of what happened was when the Protestants decided to go back and start translating things into their original language, into their spoken language, the common language, into German, into English, into Dutch, and so forth, they went and accessed Byzantine Greek Bibles and for the New Testament, and contemporary medieval Jewish Hebrew Bibles for the Old Testament text, but they hadn't always gotten the best manuscripts, so they had already introduced errors. And so the original text that they kind of work from is actually not as good. But in the meantime, in the centuries that have gone on, we now have this incredible textual tradition of lower criticism, assembling what all of the earliest sources are, and so now we have a very good sense of what the original text would have looked like. All right, so I think we did it. Thank you all so very much. Next week, I am going to be in Independence for the Triennial World Conference of our denomination, Community of Christ, and so we aren't going to be able to have a lecture, but we will see you in 2 weeks, on June 10th, and we'll announce what it is before then.